You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Daphne Zohar, and my co hosts today are Josh Schimmer, Luba Greenwood, and Matt Gline. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. So the biotech sector had a nice recovery since April's Liberation Day, with XBI up over 40%. Our colleague Tim Opler at Stifel put out a bullish report arguing biotech is poised to outperform. They calculate that the cumulative enterprise value of the entire public global biotech sector is up 89% since April's lows. And the case that Stifel makes for biotech outperforming cites a number of factors, including interest rates, which we saw one cut earlier this week and more cuts are anticipated. M&A activity is accelerating, and this was one of the major points that they made, that major pharma companies are holding $1.2 trillion in acquisition firepower as they face 180 billion in revenue at risk from patent cliffs, meaning blockbuster drugs that lose their patent status by 2030. And one interesting point they made is that the annualized M&A is tracking to be around 186 billion, making it the strongest year since 2019, despite the lack of mega deals. And we've heard a lot about the biotech winter. In fact, there was an article in the Boston Globe this week. We've heard a lot about that over the past few years with companies and programs shutting down and layoffs across the sector. But Stiefel points out that the upside of this is that there's been a healthy cleansing process, eliminating weak companies and leaving 82% is what they estimate of public US biotech value concentrated in firms with strong data sets. They have a really nice analysis where they look at the strength of the data set of different companies. And then the number of publicly traded biotechs has dropped over 20% in the past 40 months through different things happening, including bankruptcies and acquisitions, while billion-dollar companies have expanded significantly. So, again, this makes the argument that there's a healthier distribution with fewer negative enterprise value firms. Of course, there's still a number of headwinds, including continued policy uncertainty, which we're going to touch on, but many positives as well. Josh, I want to start with you, and I'm curious to see if you're seeing an improvement in investor sentiment and just overall what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, things are looking up. We have run our own analysis, actually looking at the individual components on a weighted basis of the XBI, the index that's gone pretty much nowhere for the last 10 or so years, and suggests that biotech is fairly uninvestable for generalist investors, as we've talked about plenty of times on this show. But what's really interesting is if you break down the XBI by its individual components and kind of play each one out using consensus estimates, the XBI itself looks like it's going from basically an index that's never ever on in aggregate on a weighted basis been anywhere close to profitable. It's actually now, because of some of the dynamics that you just pointed out and that Tim had pointed out, is maturing in a really interesting way. It's now just on the cusp of profitability with meaningful inflection over the next 2 to 3 years in that profitability. Um, Again, driven by maturation of the industry, companies that are having really uh, uh, excellent product launches, culling of the herd to some extent, so that the XBI includes about 120 companies, and so we're kind of reinvigorating it with high quality profitable companies, and within a couple of years you could envision the valuation of the sector in total being quite appealing to generalist investors for the first time ever, because why would anyone ever want to invest in an unprofitable sector, a sector that, by the way, was unprofitable for decades? So that's actually changing in front of our eyes. I think many are kind of getting that sense that something is really different about the industry in a very fundamental type way. It helps that the IPO window has been closed for so long that we haven't, added more speculative type names to the ecosystem. And as the IPO window opens, I think we're going to have plenty of high quality private companies move through that window to join their publicly traded peers, and again in a much healthier way than in the past. So, I'm also rather bullish on the sector in general as a result, obviously, with all the headwinds that we all know about that we're going to have to address. I think we probably have a little different views on M&A. It's been a high volume year for M&A, at least for publicly traded biotech companies. We tend to focus on those more so than the private transactions. Value, aggregate deal value, still pretty light because we're still a lot of cleanup M&A that's happening, and that's totally okay. But I think we look for forces other than M&A to really drive the sector in total, because it is really hard to move the needle using that. But it's a lot easier to move the needle when you actually create sound fundamental business models that make the sector profitable and attractive for a larger audience.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I think if I look back a few years ago, we were on this same program talking about the fact that the business model in biotech is broken or was broken. The idea that it relied so heavily on M&A, I think, was a major problem. But seeing biotechs kind of grow up and be able to launch drugs successfully is really something, I think, very positive for the sector. So let's go to Matt, just get your general comments, and then Luba will talk about a couple of the M&A transactions we saw. Well, I guess one M&A and one licensing deal this
Yeah,
week.
thanks. Look, I think I am. Sorry, can you hear me okay? I'm just making sure.
Yep.
Great. I feel like I'm sort of halfway between host and guest today, because this week I've kind of had my head in the sand. We put out some good data, but what I was going to say is it's hard to feel bad a week that you've put out good data, and so I'm all optimism. Um, I actually
Mhm.
agree with a ton of what Josh just said, and in particular, I have long thought the M&A focus of the biotech investment community is like bad long term for the sector, just because it encourages crowding, and it encourages sort of groupthink, and everyone's sort of playing this shell game of trying to figure out what other people are thinking instead of trying to figure out like what's going to work as a business. And the thing that I found really exciting about the last 24 months has been the emergence of, and some of them have been acquired, but companies like Madrigal and Verona and others and Argenx that have like launched products successfully, and that are now like turning biotech from a whatever from unprofitable, as Josh described it, to like a sort of more heterogeneity of business model, more people actually trying to do what everybody in every industry has to do, which is to build a business around their thing. And it's fun to be a part of that, and it's fun to watch it happen. And sort of seeing it work successfully across repeat examples is probably what is the biggest source of my optimism.
Yeah, and we'll come back to your data a little bit later. So thanks for joining us on what we know is a busy
Can,
week for
can I
you.
can I just
Yeah.
kind of comment on what Matt just said? Matt, congrats as well on those results. But yeah, I always get the most side-eyed look when I suggest that M&A in biotech is anything but an amazing thing for the sector. But to your point, what we wind up doing is we're depleting those companies that could drive profitability, that could be bellwether components of the XBI, that could make the industry appealing for even the generalist investors. And so we cheer these short-term victories, but it's hard not to see that how they come at the expense of the sector overall, because it's taken a lot longer than it should have for the XBI to be a profitable type index. This isn't a comment on the XBI and the direction it's headed in, because it's its own separate security. But we the sector needs profitability in reasonable amounts to draw the generalists, and without that dynamic, we're just kind of trading amongst ourselves, the same frustration, wondering what it's going to take for the sector to really start to inflect. We keep hoping that M&A is going to do the trick, but in many ways we're hoping for the wrong thing. That is because it is that M&A that sits on the sector and prevents it from being more profitable, more business minded and focused in general. So, Matt, I'm so glad you said it, because anytime I bring up something that is even remotely critical of M&A, like investors are shocked that I could ever suggest something like that. But I think you're spot on. It's a short term win for a long term questionable productivity.
It's also just boring at some level. Like whatever, not everybody on this call like lives only as an investor in biotech, but like in the industry, if the only thing that is considered, and look, I think M&A is great for the right situations, and we've sold things and we buy things all the time, and but if the only way to win is to get bought, it's just like boring. It's not that interesting. You don't get to like build fun businesses. You don't get to think about creative ways to create value that fall outside of like the narrow package it up and sell it to a big pharma company kind of outcomes. And I think a sector with more heterogeneity, with more different business models, with more creativity, is just like a more fun sector to be a part of.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to Luba. Luba, first, any thoughts generally on what's been happening in the sector? And then I'd love to hear you cover
Yeah.
the deals this week.
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree with M&A comments. Although I do have to say we do have a few sectors in healthcare that have very limited M&A options, and that's medical device and diagnostics. And none of us want to be in that sector. It's not all that fun. But I do agree with fundamentally the issues with M&A. Um, and I agree. I'm highly bullish on the sector. What's happening right now, we're fundraising. It's a great time to do that, especially if you're a clinical stage company. I think there's been a lot of cleanup in the public markets, as everyone has just mentioned. And then just one more thing to add is we're already seeing some generalists coming in, and we're also seeing some new funds that are on the public sector coming in as well. So that's all good news, and I think it's all trending in the right direction. Now to cover a few deals, speaking of M&A, first I'll start with what we saw this week. Roche is acquiring a company called 89 Bio. It's a transaction that's worth up to 3.5 billion. It is in the metabolic and cardiometabolic and liver disease space, shows again how hot the space is. Just digging into the deal and the details of it, the Roche is actually paying about 2.4 billion upfront for 14 and a half per share in cash. On top of that, shareholders have a way to earn out additional money up to that 3.5 billion with additional milestones. So they set three milestones, and they're all commercially based ones. One is to get to commercial launch in cirrhotic MASH by 2030. The other one is to get over 3 billion in global sales, and the last is getting over 4 billion in global sales. So what does that tell you? Number one, it shows that Roche sees some blockbuster potential value in this, and specifically in FGF21 therapies. The way they structured it is pretty classical milestone-based deal structure that Roche has done before. I was at Roche and M&A previously to that. We like these structures. It limits the upfront risk, but you can get quite a bit on the upside, especially if you do see this as blockbuster potential. And why does this matter, and why are people excited about this? So the drug that's currently called pegozafermin, it is in late stage development for MASH, and we've already seen, as I believe Jeff just mentioned, there's been Resdifra that was approved, which is Madrigal's drug, but it was approved for non-cirrhotic MASH. So cirrhosis still remains a pretty major unmet medical need. So if you're looking into FGF21 analogs like the 89 Bio's drug, also if you're looking at Akero's EFX drug, they are showing pretty encouraging data suggesting that there is fibrosis regression and even benefit in cirrhotics. So there's quite a bit of upside on top of the drug that's on the market today. So this is where Roche is playing really into this field. And if you're taking a step back and looking into kind of why Roche is doing this. I mean, they have had a very big push into metabolism very recently and cardiometabolic pathways. They acquire Carmot Therapeutics. They just did a pretty large deal with Zealand Pharma that was in obesity. So they want to play in the broader cardiorenal metabolic space. And they also think that you can combine FGF21 and GLP-1 to increase efficacy beyond obesity in fatty liver and beyond. So good news if you are an investor listening, if you're an operator, this validates FGF21 biology. It shows a signal that Big Pharma is still trying to consolidate all their metabolic assets. They're still playing in this field. It's still hot. It's still big. And Roche, in particular, is betting on MASH to move beyond early fibrosis into advanced disease. And they think that you can get multi-billion-dollar annual sales with this. The only risk here, of course, is the phase 3 readout is not expected until 2027. So execution risk is still high, but it's good for the future of MASH and metabolic disease.
Yeah, and you pointed out the CVR. It's interesting that it's a tool that pharma companies like to use, but it doesn't sound like the market's attributing a ton of value to the CVR and the likelihood of achieving it based on the current value. So that's sort of an interesting point. I guess the milestones seem like they maybe are a little more challenging as they were laid out.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, let's go on to the Novartis licensing of Rosa's
Oh,
degrader
yes.
programs. Yes.
So I love this because people talked last year, last few years about I&I, immunology, preclinical work, AI, and we're always worried when we start hyping up certain areas such as I&I and AI drug discovery that there's nothing to it. So for those people that are in this space and are excited about this space, this deal is actually great. It's a further validation that AI drug discovery is meaningful. Having platform technologies is meaningful, and there's still quite a lot of interest in preclinical to early clinical immunology assets. So just to give you a background, Novartis just struck a licensing deal with Monte Rosa. It is valued to about 5.27 billion. Of course, this is the total value that one could get. And it shows still a lot of interest in next generation small molecule degraders for in the immune mediated space. Now, again, they don't get all 5.7 billion upfront. Monte Rosa gets 120 million, which is still pretty good. And Novartis in return gets exclusive license for undisclosed target that is currently in discovery. And this target was developed by using Monte Rosa's AI and machine learning powered platform, which is a molecular glue degrader platform that they have called Queen. And Novartis, in addition to this one, has an option to license 2 additional programs from Monte Rosa in their preclinical immunology pipeline. So if it all goes well, with option and maintenance fees and commercial milestones, if you add all of that up, Monte Rosa could receive about 5.7 billion, but right now it's getting 120 million upfront. This is not the first deal, so this is actually Novartis has doubled down on these deals with Monte Rosa. Last year, they licensed another molecular glue degrader targeting VAV1, which is called MRT 6160. That they've in license for 150 million upfront, and then milestones that were over 2 billion. That program is already advancing in the clinic, so very exciting. So Novartis is looking to, with this deal, to get to the same place as they got to with the earlier deal. So some of the things just for investors, operators, and others in the biotech, why this is exciting, important. If you're in protein degradation, molecular glue space, pharma is betting very heavily on that space, especially Novartis continues to do so. AI drug discovery is really paying off for many companies, especially if you can come up with novel drug targets and take them through discovery and early testing and into the clinic. And upfront, again, these are big numbers, but still upfront is kind of at the modest 120 to 120 to 150 for these types of deals. So for Novartis and other pharma, it means they can keep the risk low and really look to Monte Rosa to deliver on discovery. And then once they do and hit their preclinical milestones, then Novartis can step in and help with the with development and commercial, of course. So what's good for Monte Rosa? It gives it cash, of course, credibility, future investment and partnerships. They're exclusive on these particular molecules, but they're opened up to potential partnership with others. And what's
Hmm.
exciting for them, they can also extend to finance. They have multiple programs that they're interested to finance into phase two.
Yeah. Thank you, Luba. Those are really helpful insights on those deals. So let's move on to data. Earlier this week, aTyr Pharma announced that their phase 3 study of efzofitimod in pulmonary sarcoidosis did not meet its primary endpoint. Matt, I believe Roivant ran a phase 2 study in this indication that also didn't show benefit. Any thoughts on the aTyr study and learnings for others considering this indication?
Yeah, thanks. We had a failed study ourselves in an anti-GM-CSF antibody in sarcoidosis just about a year ago, a little bit less than a year ago. Look, I think first of all, if you're not familiar with sarcoidosis, this is a tough disease. It's a tough disease, and that makes me glad that people have done work in it, including aTyr. Uh, a couple 100,000 patients, very sick, high morbidity, high mortality, and really no option. I mean, these patients are treated with sort of the normal range of immunosuppressants and steroids and things like that, but mostly no good treatment options. So, first of all, I'll say failed study or not, I mean, good on aTyr for giving it a go, and I think it's an area that desperately needs successful development. I think one of the interesting things about the aTyr study that failed was the primary endpoint, which was a true steroid sparing endpoint, right? They were trying to show uh, a delta in the steroid reduction of patients on drug versus off on a placebo adjusted basis. And they showed some, I think they were maybe powered for a 3 milligram delta or something like that, or that was their target. And they showed, I think, like a zero. 0.7 or zero. 0.8 milligram delta relative to placebo. I think it's interesting, and we see this across a whole bunch of diseases, especially in autoimmune disease, where there's sort of FDA established endpoints. There are often these composite scales that are subject to high placebo responses, and it's just very hard to find a good way to study disease progression. And then docs really want to get patients off steroids. So I think it was like an interesting choice of endpoint, and I think aTyr did some interesting things, including starting with a relatively high baseline level of steroid burden for the patient population, which probably made the study harder to enroll to maximize their probability of succeeding here. Disappointing they didn't. I'd say the one most common piece of pushback I've heard on the study is I think the drug mechanistically is a little bit unclear in terms of how it was going to work in the disease, but they had reasonable human clinical data going into this study. And so, obviously a disappointing outcome. This definitely is one of these situations, maybe like Abivax even earlier this summer, where I think the general consensus view was this study had a real uphill battle and probably wasn't going to work. And so I heard it come up a lot from investors because it was the kind of thing where if it had worked, I think it would have had a pronounced effect on the stock price. So disappointing that didn't happen. Disappointing outcome to the study, but interesting study design and interesting focus on steroid sparing as a clinical benefit.
Yeah, and one interesting point here is, as you point out, it was a closely followed study, and there was a lot of discussion, sort of a battle of longs versus shorts. On the short side, there were a few very active accounts, particularly on X or Twitter, and one of them was Martin Shkreli, who posted in late July that he believed the study would fail and that the stock would be down 80%. He pretty much hit it on the head, and I know that short sellers are viewed as the bad guys by many, but I think a thoughtful short analysis can be helpful to longs, for example, and understanding the weaknesses of a data set, even if one is going to be long. And it may also be helpful to management, I think, in understanding parts of their story that aren't resonating. I feel like these short sellers and the skeptics are sometimes maligned, too much. I actually think that they have a very, an important place in our ecosystem. I'm curious what you guys think about that.
I would say they can. On the other hand, we've seen some very aggressive, very visible short reports that actually cause confusion amongst patient and clinician groups, and that's a very unfortunate repercussion of these groups that lay out their short proposals. Oftentimes, with a mix of accurate information, but also some misleading information. So it can be important and valuable for checks and balances in the industry. But on the other hand, when it starts to interfere with companies that are really trying to do best for patients and only causes confusion. We saw that recently with the company Agios, where I think some Fairies database cases were just kind of taken out of context without all the right information surrounding them to assuage not only investors but more importantly the patient and physician community. Yeah, it can be dangerous.
Yeah, and it's also dangerous for the shorts when they do that
Yeah.
because they get killed afterwards.
As an
Yeah,
issuer, a healthy short thesis in your data as an issuer is to me just like almost entirely upside, right? Like
yeah,
a healthy short volume uh, drives rapid price discovery on good data, which is great for the issuer and for the longs in those
yeah,
situations. And the other nice, quote unquote, nice thing about shorts in biotech is, look, as long as as long as the company they're shorting doesn't need to raise money before the data, ultimately science will come and be the reckoning of the question, and they'll be right or they'll be wrong, and the world will move accordingly. So, I think it's sort of an interesting dynamic. Um, I
yeah.
also think it's interesting. Uh, Martin's a very popular figure on Twitter, and his analysis is fun to read. I think he's like a good writer and a really thoughtful guy. It's interesting to talk about him in this context now, because obviously his history in the industry also gets talked about a lot.
Yeah, I actually he's been spot on for a few of these, but and he's got a huge following. But it's
Yeah, he
it's
really does.
interesting. Yeah. So Matt, you announced positive data this week in your Privant phase 3 Valor study. Tell us about it.
We did, thanks. And in the past, when I've gotten on and talked about our own data, there's been sort of some Twitter back and forth on whether it was appropriate to have a host promoting something that happened in their
Yeah, I think
data.
you're a
So
guest. You're
yeah,
technically a guest this
I'm a
week.
guest
Yeah.
today. I'll
Yeah.
take it,
Okay.
but because I'm going to say good things about it because I'm really pleased with it. Look, this was a great result for us. We had acquired brepocitinib. It's a dual inhibitor of JAK1 and TYK2 from Pfizer a few years ago, at a time when JAK inhibitor development was at a local nadir, with the sort of black box class morning showing up, and people sort of weren't sure where the field was going to go. And our view was some whatever baby had been thrown out with bathwater, as it was, and that at a minimum there was a huge opportunity to continue to use these very powerful mechanisms in severe orphan disease where there were not very many other options. And dermatomyositis was our sort of first lead indication, where it's an interferon and IL-12 and 23 driven disease, where both JAK1 and TYK2 were going to be helpful mechanistically, and bluntly, where there really hasn't been a novel therapy successfully developed in a very long time. IVIG had a positive study, and an IVIG from Pfizer Octagam was approved a few years ago, but IVIGs have been used a long time. They're not really sort of novel, and it's a graveyard of drug development. There have been probably 9 or 10 failed studies in the last couple of decades of major mechanisms, and so we ran this study eyes wide open. I think there were a lot of questions about conduct, about placebo, about sort of how it was going to develop. And we just saw beautiful separation. We saw a great TIS delta. We saw a really good set of outcomes across skin and muscle disease. Dermatomyositis is a pretty devastating inflammatory disease of both the skin and the muscle. And we saw really good benefit across both sort of the standard measures and then also like patient reported kind of disability indices and things like that. Really nice data. And because of the way we ran the study, which had a mandatory steroid taper in it, we were also able to show that we were able to deliver meaningful clinical benefit against a backdrop of significantly reduced steroid burden, which, apropos the entire conversation, is something docs care a lot about. So, really great week
Yeah.
for us. Really great week, we think, for dermatomyositis patients, and excited to carry this one forward.
Yeah. And now is Proivant, sorry, yeah, Priovant, that's private and you guys own it. So like the Roivant would be, because I was just wondering, the Roivant stock price, I think very typical of these hub and spoke models, didn't get the same type of value appreciation that you would have expected if this was a Roivant wholly owned program and if you were more of like a traditional biotech. I obviously know a little bit about this because I founded a company that had a very similar model to Roivant, PureTech. So curious
Yeah,
what your thoughts are on that.
yeah. Look. I think first of all, this effectively is a Roivant program. Priovant is
Yeah,
effectively a 75-25 JV between us and Pfizer. We own 75%. They own 25%.
yeah,
It's really our program. The Priovant team has done a phenomenal job running it. Um, stock price reaction. I guess like it's hard to call. There was not a big short thesis going into this data, in part because Roivant had a pretty big market cap and a bunch of other components to it, including a lot of cash. And so I think part of the sort of price discovery pace here is going to be on its own on its own course. We're a little bigger in market cap than some of the other companies that have data readouts. We had run up a bit into data for a
Uh-huh.
variety of reasons, including developments elsewhere in the business. So I think it's like a little bit hard to pull all those pieces apart. That said, and this is the commercial part, and I'm sorry, I think our setup from here forward is as good as it's ever been or better. We have now this program, which is exactly the kind of drug that Josh and I were talking about earlier. Companies have launched successfully in our space. We have more data coming for this drug. We have data coming in our FcRn franchise. So I care
Yeah.
relatively little about the stock price reaction this week and a lot more about what it means for the next,
Yeah.
months and years.
Yeah, and you didn't raise data on the back of this the date. I mean, you didn't raise money on the back of the data either, which I think
We
is a
we do not
positive.
need it.
Yeah.
I
Okay,
think,
great. Well,
okay, can I
sorry,
just
go ahead.
maybe weigh in on
Yeah.
this? Because I think Roivant and just a small number of similar companies highlight a couple of shortcomings of, I guess, just the investment landscape. And one is that Roivant, Matt, to your credit, has put the ROI in Roivant through your performance to date, and yet probably struggle to get credit that you'll be able to do so in the future, right? I mean, we all recognize past performance is not a predictor of future performance, but given the Roivant track record, you'd think there'd be a little bit of, well, let's give this team some benefit of the doubt that they're going to continue to really generate value. The other challenge that you see in Daphne, I think kind of allude to this, when you have these hub and spoke models, or even if you don't, if you just have a very deep pipeline of very attractive programs, for whatever reason, investors become increasingly reluctant to ascribe value beyond the first, one or two assets. And so it leaves these companies that have very promising portfolios with costs of capitals that probably higher than they should be, which can make it challenging that for them to fund all this incredible innovation. You wind up having to kind of make choices that you might otherwise not have wanted to make, just because, again, you're not getting full credit for that portfolio. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. To me, it's a bit of a shortcoming from the investment community to not see a little bit forward beyond the what have you done for me lately, or what's on the very near term horizon, and think a little bit longer term, think a little bit more holistically about a company and its valuation.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of that. And that's also been across the board in biotech, this idea that you just got to focus on the key program and get to data. That's partly been, a result of the market. But it is interesting that companies that are able to advance multiple programs and maybe don't have as much need to fundraise because they're generating cash elsewhere, um, I don't think the market knows how to understand them as much. But anyway, let's move on. Josh, I know you track a lot of companies that are private, and you talked a bit about the quality of the private companies that are out there. There's a couple that you've been tracking that announced data this week. Can you tell us more about them?
Yeah, so there is like, with the IPO window having been closed for so long, the private companies are forced to mature, generate data that otherwise would have been generated in a very binary way in the public markets. And so we are seeing a very different private company, biotech company ecosystem. So a couple of data points this week. The team from Areteia, a wonderful team who actually pulled a product out of Biogen, aripiprazole, that failed in ALS. But what they saw in that trial was an interesting signal of significant reduction in eosinophil count. So naturally, they repurposed that for asthma, eosinophilic asthma, and after working on this program for some time, came out with positive phase 3 results. So as basically an oral option to treat eosinophilic asthma, which remains a very large unmet medical need. So nice to see that data point. Not tremendously surprising, because they had done such a good job characterizing it. But again, now we've got another private company that has positive phase 3 data, and will have to figure out their own strategy going forward. And then a very different company called Apollo Therapeutics. They're based in the UK, which might actually be an interesting segue into UK innovation and what's been going on lately. But it's another really wonderful team. They've formed a number of partnerships with some of the leading academic centers in the UK to try to tech transfer some of their more promising programs. And so what they just announced was positive data in atopic dermatitis for their IL-17 antibody. The top level results sound quite good. We don't have all the details, just the active treatment arm, not the placebo arm. But again, just kind of reflective of what we're seeing in the private company space, with companies being forced to hit milestones, risk or de-risk before they come to the public markets. And I think ultimately that is very healthy for the public markets at the end of the day. I'm not sure if we want to talk about what's been going on in the UK here,
Yeah.
or save that for
Yeah,
later.
no, this is a perfect segue. So we can talk about that. So over the last week, three big pharma companies announced plans to leave the UK in some form or another. So not fully leave, but abandon different projects. Merck is abandoning a planned £1 billion London Research Centre and withdrawing from existing UK R&D facilities in the Crick Institute and London Bioscience Innovation Centre. AstraZeneca announced plans to forego a $270 million UK vaccine facility, and then Lilly announced it's reconsidering plans for UK Lilly Gateway Labs. And in general, these companies and others have criticized the business environment in the UK, which we can talk a little bit about. It's important to point out, and I think you touched on this with Apollo, that the UK is home to leading scientists, universities, early stage investors, and of course, a couple major pharma companies. It has all of the ingredients of a biotech hub like Boston and San Francisco, but it really hasn't been able to pick up steam in that direction, and it raises interesting questions of what's held it back. So, the issues have a lot to do with over regulation and what's been pointed to as anti business policy. We had some really interesting discussions with UK company founders and investors who have been expressing really unprecedented bleakness about the UK life science environments. Lastly, it's a tough place to develop and sell drugs, and there's also the pull factor with Trump administration policies pulling companies to make manufacturing commitments in the US. So, I think let's split this discussion into two. The first part of it is the UK drug pricing model and some of the US policy stuff around manufacturing. And then the second, which we can do following that, is this idea of the UK and why it hasn't been able to be a biotech hub. Like what's missing? So let's start with the first one, and maybe Josh, you can talk about the UK drug pricing model and some of the policy stuff.
Yeah, I mean they're at the extreme end of conservatism in terms of paying for value when it comes to innovation. I think the challenge though is that there's a reason that innovation is priced as high as it is, and that is to incentivize more innovation. And it's interesting because, right, you point out UK really hasn't hit their stride when it comes to bio innovation, but on the other hand, they're not interested, right? I mean, they've made that very clear by having the nice effort to really limit the amount that they spend on drugs, and as such, the amount that they're willing to commit to innovation. And it's becoming a serious issue, as we know now, with the U.S. Looking for other companies to start paying their fair share for the innovation that they do benefit from. There are all sorts of factors here, including China in particular, as a country that likely is willing to provide lower source innovation for the globe. China's not quite ready to do it broad scale like the U.S. has been, building over the last number of decades. But there are a lot of colliding forces at play when it comes to drug price and drug spend. But it's certainly not unreasonable to ask countries who are going to benefit from the innovation to pay their fair share. And it gets into the broader framework as well, like aTyr's framework for how to ascribe value to drugs. And at least from my perspective, which I think is a little bit different than others might have, the question isn't around value, right? The question is, what's the right framework of pricing to incentivize more innovation? Because that's really the only justification for these high drug prices. And I see very few of the policymakers, the think tanks, the ICERs of the world, the NICEs of the world ever sit down and talk to investors or analysts who ultimately are the ones that are going to be making the decision to allocate capital to new R&D outside of, kind of the realm of profitable biopharma companies. But that's really all that matters, right? If you create a system that doesn't reward innovation, there's going to be no innovation. And if you create a system that does, there will be. And if you create a system that over incentivizes innovation, we'll have too much innovation. But that's not the lens that you hear these drug price discussions ever talked about, which I find a little frustrating.
Can I just say, first of all, I think you don't have to look that far back in history to see a lot of innovation coming out of the UK. And obviously, there's a few big pharma companies who have done a lot of work there. Cambridge is still a biotech hub. Like, I don't know that it's totally clear, or Oxford too. I don't know that it's totally clear what the history there. I also just, to me, and I'm not close to any of these decisions, this looks a little bit like the UK as a place is just getting a little bit unlucky in a game of geopolitical chess, in part, which is it's true that drug prices are comparatively low there. They're not that much lower than other important places in Europe, but like it's just they are the intersection of like a relatively small commercial market where investments had been promised. And I feel like part of what most of big pharma is trying to do is to prove to the Trump administration that the US is getting something in exchange for the bargain that is like critically financial important to them. And nothing speaks louder in the current political moment than like shifting dollars of investment, especially big sum dollars of investment. And I feel like the concentrated group of this activity is as much a signal to the US as it is to the UK.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I don't, I agree with you on that point, although I think luck has nothing to do with this. I just want to go back to Josh's point that outside of drug pricing, the UK has done very minimal to understand what type of environment to create to incentivize the company builds and to incentivize investment and to build real innovation hubs. So when we say that, and I've spent quite some time, and I do want to say a call out that I have been on boards, for example, on a board of AppCam, which is a true outstanding company that was just bought by Danaher. That's an outlier. I'm on another board of a private company called CLM, amazing British company. That's also an outlier. Other than those two and a few handful of others, have a challenging environment. That again, drug pricing is one thing, but environment that creates everything from the regulation of how boards are structured to the investment environment to having incentives to investors to also having incentives to company founders and company builders, everything from tax incentives to how boards and companies are structured. So the UK has a significant issue, and I would love to also hear, Daphne, your thoughts. I know you've built a company yourself that is on the UK stock exchange. I mean, what are your thoughts? And then I'll happy to also chime in addition of the issue with the biotech hubs in the UK. And by the way, it's not a recent phenomenon. They've had issues going years back.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I'll note that Michal Preminger has just joined us from the audience. She recently was at J&J, and before that, she ran the Harvard Tech Licensing Office and knows a lot about biotech hubs. So we'll hear from her as well after I say a few words, and then maybe Luba, I think you wanted to comment. So I think that you make a great point about these incentives for business. So like the way I look at it is a lot of regulation in the UK is around protecting downside as opposed to incentivizing upside, and that you see that across the board. So for example, they have you talked about boards. Boards they frown upon board members having shares in the company, where you think like that would align interests, but that they worry about conflicts of interest, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. So there's a lot of this regulation that is around protecting, and I think that's important. But the problem is they've missed the upside part. They have this UK takeover panel, which is meant to protect UK investors, but I would guess that that panel has probably lost investors in the UK billions of dollars because of the way that they were kind of over concerned about, the ability to do deals and, whether companies will leave the UK. What it ends up doing is it really does make it less interesting for investors there. But I do think, it's really interesting because there is such great science and there's great entrepreneurs and there's great early stage investors. And so this idea of the overregulation and the tax incentives and, all of those things I think have really been holding back the ability to build companies there. And of course, for the stock market, there is also very challenging. So, we, for example, we raised money, we listed on the main market, not on the AIM, raised about $200 million in an IPO. And, there's some amazing, very smart investors there that, the problem though is that the UK government is not really incentivizing investment in the UK. But I think it's a really interesting question of like what are the elements that create these biotech hubs like Boston, Cambridge, and for example, San Francisco. And I'd love to hear more from you, Luba, and from Michal on that point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And on as you know, also I'm on the board of Mass Bio, so we talk about this quite a bit, and we also meet with similar hubs across really the world, including in Basel and in Cambridge and Oxford and in the UK. And the of course science is number one, and UK has it in their hubs. Number two is access to capital. So, and number three is often being again accessible to hospitals, being accessible to amazing talent of people that don't just start up companies, but they're able to build companies and scale companies, and not just the CEO function, but a CFO and other functions. I can tell you, looking at the UK companies, I think that there needs to be additional training just because of the level, the regulatory level, and how companies are run in the UK. There aren't that many CFO and financial level people that can go and be part of a startup because they think very differently. They think in a way that is not helpful to a startup in the UK. So yes, there's a lot of talent in the United Kingdom, which is something that you need, is something that we have here in Boston, and across multiple different areas. So everything from science to law to business to finance. We have that, but a lot of that talent is not actually trained to start up companies or be in a cross-functional startup environment for and build a company for growth. So that is certainly one area for training where the UK needs help, and what makes a hub very successful. And and I think if the government was open to again tone down the regulation and incentivize investors and incentivize talent that can go into the startups, it would be a whole different world for the UK. Michal, I would love to
Yeah.
know what you think. I know you've been in this for a long, long time.
Yes, of course, and happy to share the experience of serving on the Mass Bio board with you. Maybe I'll add a number four to your list. And number four is the presence of pharma companies in the same environment as we talk about the Cambridge ecosystem. The idea that you can very easily, as a young company, do what we call the walk, and within 25 minutes visit every pharma company and get the access to the expertise and the understanding of what will happen downstream from where you are right now, and what regulatory and development considerations you may want to incorporate into your plan early on, and the choice of first indication, all of those amazing things, and of course the cross fertilization in terms of talent. And I think that for the UK, to alienate and lose presence of big pharma in that ecosystem, which is already also very distributed. I mean, we do have the golden triangle in Cambridge, Oxford, but it is a very different phenotype of an ecosystem, and yet really amazing opportunities. I can say just from the J&J experience, J&J has an innovation center in London, which is serving all of Europe, but definitely the UK ecosystem is top um, a top performer there in terms of early stage companies. And again, the challenges of growing and so on, you already mentioned. But I wanted to take us back to Cambridge and the Massachusetts ecosystem and actually highlight an article or a white paper that Peter Kurczynski wrote this week about the Massachusetts paradox. And he's highlighting um, his concern about an environment in which, clearly there's a lot of support for biotech in Massachusetts, but also it is home to some of the most aggressive, let's say, politicians and representatives who are actually pushing policies at the federal level that are very harmful to biotech and biopharma in general. And he's actually, it is a 12,000 word article that he's encouraging each one of us to read because it includes both a description of the issue and what we can do about it as an industry and it is a test case but really with inspiration I think for any ecosystem around the globe because we can ask ourselves, if in Massachusetts, where we are responsible for so much of the economic growth and prosperity, we are kind of still unable to advocate and to get our representatives to support us, how could any other ecosystem expect to do so? So I just want to encourage people to actually take a look at it. I think it is fascinating. It's important for us to be educated about those topics, and maybe we can take one of the next Biotech Hangout sessions to dig in once people have read it.
Yeah, and we can share a link to that.
I'm
Yeah.
going to put a
Okay.
link right
Yeah.
now
Okay.
at the chat.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so we're almost at the top of the hour, and I know that we wanted to touch on a few other policy updates. Josh, do you want to hit real quick? I think the J&J pricing announcement on their bladder cancer drug and impact on CG Oncology, HHS, and ACIP.
Yeah, a bunch going on to cover quickly. J&J got approval of their TAR 200 gemcitabine eluting pretzel in Lexo. Price pretty high. First year of therapy for a full course would be close to 750,000. That falls to about 150,000 in the second year because the frequency of administration of the therapy falls in the second year. But just kind of another signal in terms of the direction that drug prices can continue to head. On HHS, there was the HELP committee meeting that brought in Dr. Menarez to talk about her firing from head of CDC. I would say it was maybe like 4-1 balance in terms of those who are really very concerned about the direction that CDC is headed with leadership relative to the couple of Republican senators. I think geared their questions more towards Dr. Menarez and her own integrity, which seems to be fairly impeachable. So we'll see how what direction this heads in. There's certainly increasing pushback against RFK's decision making and policies, and that kind of dovetails into the ACIP meetings that was going on yesterday. I haven't been able to watch as much of it today, but I don't know, it's a very new ACIP committee composition. They're clearly, many of them are approaching questions around vaccines with far more caution than the prior ACIP committee meeting. I think the biggest challenge is that there's just not perfect data to answer the myriad of questions that have been raised about vaccines and vaccine policies. So, a lot of vaccine policy comes down to expert judgment, and we've replaced a very pro-vaccine and pro-science panel with a group that we're fairly defensive about being characterized as anti-vaccine. Many of them are asking reasonable questions around safety, et cetera. I mean, it did illustrate their lack of expertise in the subject matter, and at times made for some very cringy moments. But I think the big challenge here is that a lot of the discussions are out of the realm of where data can clearly illustrate, and we're everyone has to extrapolate based on the available data, and some are more comfortable extrapolating favorably, others are very uncomfortable extrapolating favorably, and that's just creating a lot of noise, confusion, uncertainty. It's not a great look, but I guess from some lenses it's at least an understandable look.
Yeah, it's interesting because the quality of the advisors is also going to have an impact. And I've been a little bit disappointed, not even, not just with regard to vaccine, but in other areas, the advisors that they're bringing in, um, they have conflicts. They're not pharma companies, they're not pharma representatives, but they have their own personal conflicts, and I think that's a real problem. Anybody else have comments on the policy points that Josh just touched on before we wrap up the show? Okay, so let's just go around and see if people have any closing remarks. I mean, I think in summary, this it feels like maybe there's some green shoots. People are feeling more optimistic about biotech. One missing piece is the public markets. I mean, the follow-ons are strong, but not really IPOs yet, with the one exception last week, which was I think okay. But seems like sentiment has improved substantially since our lows of April. Love to hear from the others, and then we'll wrap up the session.
I would just add, biotech looks like it actually has the makings of a business model, and that's what it's going to take for the sector to thrive from here.
Hmm.
One of the main reasons this is a fun industry to be in is because ultimately you run experiments and generate data, and it matters for patients. And so that's what dominated my week. Is just it's exciting to be a part of that, and I feel great for what we've delivered for dermatomyositis patients and what I hope that means long term. So that has painted my week with optimism, and just is a fun reminder of why we do what we do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there's optimistic outlook, and we all are quite optimistic. One of the things, actually, when we talked about the hubs, I was going to mention one that the one thing that we have here in Boston, also in California, is we're hyper optimistic, even when the fundamentals are not 100% there. And that's what drives innovation, and that's what drives change for patients. Matt, I'm similar boat as you are right now, looking into how our patients are doing, and are doing so well in our trial. And it's that's what's important ultimately.
Yeah, if it wasn't, for the optimism, none of these drugs would ever get developed. I mean, I think all of us are really focused on that, on developing new medicines for patients, and that optimism over years and years, and very challenging circumstances is what enables us to deliver these new medicines. So, yeah, I think it's a very important piece of it. Well, anyway, thank you all for joining today, and Michal for jumping up from the audience. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and thank you for joining us on Biotech Hangout. We'll see you next week.